hello internet, hello fandom forward people, hello NaNoWriMo people. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I want to I see everybody saying hi in the chat. Hi, 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 hi. I want to do a quick introduction because we have a lot of people watching and I am so excited about that. And I want to let you all know a little bit about who I am in Fandom Forward in this campaign, because I know some of you are coming from the Fandom Forward side, and we love you, and that's amazing. And some of you are coming from the NaNoWriMo side, and we love you, and that's amazing. But also, you don't know who I am. So, real quick, I am Katie Bowers. I'm the managing director at Fandom Forward. Fandom Forward is a nonprofit that uses pop culture and beloved stories to engage fans in social justice movements so that they can help power those movements with creativity and joy and unironic enthusiasm. In other words, we turn fans into heroes. If you want to know more about our chapters program and our campaigns and stuff, you can go to fandomforward.org. But you all are here tonight because you are taking part in our Book Defenders campaign. So for several months, we have been working on a campaign around protecting banned books and keeping stories on the shelves. Because we all know there are book bans happening all across the United States. They are targeting queer authors and stories. They are targeting people of color. They are targeting folks with disabilities, but definitely a huge focus on queer authors. And so we have been working with students and activists and librarians all across the country to get folks involved with pushing back against those bans and trying to make sure that these stories stay on the shelf, stay accessible to students and communities all across the country. So it's been a busy couple of months. It's been a fun couple of months. And this week, for Banned Books Week, we wanted to kind of focus on the future and focus on the theme of keep writing banned books. Because when you are a writer, an aspiring writer, someone who is creating these like beautiful, interesting stories from different marginalized perspectives, writing right now can be really intimidating in such a kind of like hostile atmosphere. And so we wanted to create spaces for writers to come together and sort of learn, like, how do we keep honing that skill? How do we keep growing? How do we keep motivated to keep writing? And so we reached out to our friends at NaNoWriMo and we were like, we love you all. This is what we want to do. Do you have any ideas? And they were like, we love you too. We love this idea. We know the perfect author who's going to be able to help out with this. And so that's what we're doing tonight, is we're going to be talking about craft in the real world with Matthew and Grant. And I'm going to read their biographies to introduce them real quick, and then they're going to come in and they're going to wow you with amazing things about writing. Before we do, I just want to let people know two things. Number one, I see a lot of you chatting in the chat, or over here, chatting in the chat. Perfect, you already got it. You can put questions in there for our facilitators. If you should keep in mind, there's about a 30-second delay on there before anybody's going to see what you have written. And we will be feeding questions through to the panelists, and so they might not get to everything, but go ahead and ask the questions you have, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. The other thing I want people to know is we have lovely merch in our store, fandomforward.org/shop, that supports all the work we've been doing around banned books. So we have like our You Keep Banning, We'll Keep Reading shirt that has like some titles of books we love. We have our Keep Writing Banned Books notebooks and posters, and those are a great way that if you like the kind of work we're doing, you can go there, you can purchase this stuff, and all the purchases go back into supporting the campaign and the amazing authors and activists we work with. Speaking of which, I'm going to do some intros right now to our panelists, and then they're going to join us. So, first up, actually, maybe y'all should be here in the room so people can match your face to your bio. Hey! Hi, Grant. Hi, Matthew.
Hey, Katie.
Hey. So thank you both for being here. I'm going to read some quick intros. So, Grant Faulkner is the executive director of National Novel Writing Month, also known as NaNoWriMo, and the co-founder of the 100 Word Story. He's published 2 books on writing, Pep Talks for Writers and Brave the Page, a teen writing guide. He's also published All the Comfort Sin Can Provide, which is a great title. It's a collection of short stories. Fissures, a collection of 100-word stories, and Nothing Short of 100 select tales from a 100-word story. His stories have appeared in dozens of literary magazines, including Tin House, the Southwest Review, the Gettysburg Review, and he's been anthologized in collections such as Norton's New Micro, Exceptionally Short Fiction, and Best Small Fictions. And his essays have been published in the New York Times and Poets and Writers and LitHub and Writer's Digest and The Writer. And he serves on the National Writing Project's Writers Council, LitCam's Advisory Council, and Aspen Words Creative Council. And he's also the co-host of the podcast Write Minded. Grant, do you like to write?
Thank you, Katie. I've got to shorten that bio.
And Matthew Salis is the author of 7 books, most recently the national bestseller, Craft in the Real World. Oh my gosh, it's the title of the workshop. And also the Penn Faulkner final, there it is, right there. The Penn Faulkner finalist, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. Forthcoming in January is a new novel, The Sense of Wonder, another excellent title. He was adopted from Korea and lives in New York City, where he is an assistant professor of writing at Columbia. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm gonna leave you to it to do the magic. Thank you for being here so much.
Thank you, Katie. I'm just going to hold this up one more time. Craft in the Real World, Matthew's wonderful book. And I say that because I'm kind of a craft book junkie. I love reading about how to write. And I think I'd gotten a little bored with craft books because they had become so redundant, I think some of the kind of gospel of craft was so deeply rooted in the writing community that a lot of things were being repeated as if they were the gospel truth. And the wonderful thing that I found refreshing and invigorating about Matthew's book is just the way that he questioned a lot of that and really deconstructed it and made me think about craft in kind of a new, refreshing, and invigorating way. So thank you so much for writing Craft in the Real World, Matthew.
No, thanks for having me here. Thanks everybody watching.
Yeah, and I want to start off. Actually, yesterday, by coincidence, I was taking a walk and I stopped by one of those little free libraries and looked in it. I saw the book Art and Fear, which I've actually never read. But I paged through it and I saw this definition of craft as the vehicle for expressing your vision. It said craft is the visible edge of your art. And so I was wondering how you define craft, just so everybody who's watching kind of knows what we mean by craft. And then why do you think that a discussion of craft is important, especially now?
Yeah, so for me, those go together. The book is an attempt to define craft, and the definition is a set of cultural expectations. And, I found as a student and as a teacher, I was often talking about, expectations that we had as readers for how a story might go, what a character might do, how a character changes over the course of a story or a book. And I kind of wondered if we step back, and asked like what these things are and where they come from. It seemed pretty clear that we were getting our ideas for what a story should be from other stories, right? And if you think about the way people become writers, they usually start as readers, people who love books and then also want to make them. And the reason why we need to kind of then look at craft in a new way is because we've kind of obscured the fact that these are cultural expectations, and we think of them as kind of like universal truths when really they come from a specific history of reading, and which is why you'll see even just small differences between different writers thinking about what a plot is. But then if you kind of open those things up to what we Americans might think as plot is versus what Japanese writers might think as a plot is, or South African writers, those might be a little bit different depending on their own reading histories. And then, of course, like bringing in different experiences in storytelling that comes from identity and cultural backgrounds, being raised in different cultures and its environments. All of that stuff then goes into what we think a story is. And we're often kind of taught out of the things we would say a story is, and taught to think of a story in a certain way.
That's so interesting, your phrase, taught out of the things that we think a story is. And I recently, I'm going to interview Samantha Chang tomorrow. And in researching the interview, I read about how she said that, she's actually my age. And so I've really related to this. She came up in writing school and writing workshops, and the dominant way that you're kind of supposed to write, the universal truth, as you put it, was minimalism. It was very popular as a type of writing, a style of writing then, and very popular and dominant in writing workshops. And so she grew up with that. So like she was a young student, eager to absorb, wisdom from others. And so she wrote her early work in a kind of minimalist, restrained style, and it was very successful work. But then when but it wasn't allowing her to tell the stories she wanted to tell in the way she wanted to tell them. So her most recent novel, The Family Chow, she wrote it in what she says a much more loud and humorous way that kind of wasn't allowed by minimalism. And so I just found that aesthetic shift very interesting. And I'm curious if you have had any kind of similar shifts that have allowed you to tell stories that you wouldn't have, tell different stories or tell them differently, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great book too, Family Chow. I like what she says about how she was, when I was in my MFA, I think we were told we can use 3 exclamation points for our entire lives and to choose them carefully. And I see them as something she says about how many exclamation points there are in the novel, and there are hundreds of them. I also kind of grew up in the same, not grew up with, but learned in the same tradition in graduate school, and wrote my first book in that tradition as well. And then kind of trying to reach into stories that got more at my own experience and the experience of people that I wanted to reach with my book specifically. Other Korean adoptees or other Asian American liberals. I found I couldn't kind of write in those styles, and had to reach for different kinds of storytelling. And I found a lot of it in Asian American literature. I taught Asian American literature for a long time, and also, of course, read and write Asian American literature. And some of the kind of foundational concepts or moves in Asian American literature. There's this theory about heterogeneity, hybridity, and multiplicity. Things that kind of try to capture how large a swath of identity Asian Americans encompass, and how those stories can be told then in a way that that can't be kind of captured in the traditional 3-act structure about a single character. I felt too that I needed to get away from that to write about like the split self that I felt as an adoptee and as a person of color.
Yeah, interesting. That 3-act structure is one of those dominant principles that I think it's hard to write around it sometimes. It's so dominant. I just see it everywhere. So I'm kind of curious, how did you think of plot differently, if not through the 3-act structure?
Yeah, so one of the things I learned about was Kishuten Ketsu, which is a 4-act structure, kind of has a similar setup, but then the second act develops that, and the third act is a twist. So it kind of, and it's not a plot twist per se, it's more of like a twist in how you understand what the story is. And the final part is somewhat of a resolution or a return. And I found that that kind of represented a way of thinking about a kind of development of identity that I understood, where you sort of have a moment. I think this happens to a lot of people, where you sort of realize that you've been thinking of yourself in one way, or were taught to think of yourself as in one way, and now that you have kind of passed a certain threshold, done some learning and growing, you sort of realize that the things you thought were true before were not true, and you're actually much more able to be somebody who you yourself can define. And that is a kind of twist that I have experienced in life, and I think that many people do experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. How a different structure and shape of the story allowed a different type of expression and recognition. I think I really related to what Katie was saying, and the kind of the mantra behind this webcast of keep writing banned books. And I was thinking that this is banned books week, obviously, and there are a lot of books that are banned by different societal factions for a whole bunch of reasons. But we also do sometimes personally ban our own books and our own expression. And I think that's especially for NaNoWriMo, at least that's, our mantra is your story matters. And so we want people to write their story and define how it matters in the world. So I was wondering, what would you say, or have you ever not given yourself permission to write a book? And if so, how did you overcome that to write it, to keep writing banned books? And what would you say to people who are viewing this right now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty accurate and relatable, I dare say,
Yeah.
to think that you're kind of banning yourself from writing certain books. Though I don't think we would usually think of it as banning, but more as like trying to write what we think is a book, right? So, as a young writer, I wrote white characters, kind of in these kind of Hemingway-ish stories, minimalist stories, having experiences that were quite different from my own and that I didn't really totally understand. And the characters always felt like there's something missing in them. And it wasn't until I kind of gave myself permission to write for a different audience and to include some of those things that really make up how I understand the world and how I understand being in the world, that I was able to, unban myself, or rather just kind of write stories that I didn't kind of have growing up or see a lot of as a student, or wasn't told were the kind of stories that would last or win prizes or be taught in schools or whatever.
That's a good, you remind me of once an MFA writing professor found out that I was worked at NaNoWriMo and was executive director of NaNoWriMo, and she said, tell all your people to quit writing vampire stories. And so I think but it brings up this interesting point, is the writing workshops that we're talking about, the MFA programs that are in universities. Oftentimes they're very biased against genre. And I know that we have a lot of genre writers who are watching this webcast. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit about, because that's a type of banned story, really, in academia.
Yeah, and literary fiction is its own genre. I mean, I think we could all admit that. You would know it when you see it. There are certain things that it's doing. Maybe it would be great if we could just try to less write the stories that we think are stories that will sell, or stories that will, be approved by our professors or help us, get into MFA programs, and just try to think about what a story means to us and how we can tell it in a way that only we can tell it.
Yeah, it's the Toni Morrison statement of write the story you want to read, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people start. I have kind of come to a place where I feel like I want to write the story that I want a certain person to read. Sometimes it's my kids when they grow up, or sometimes it's other parent adoptees, or somebody who I can kind of reach out to that isn't exactly myself, but that I maybe wish I could be in conversation with in a way that only a book can be.
Interesting. I was going to ask if we could drill down and talk into a specific craft element. So I was wondering, what's one key Western notion of craft and storytelling that you upend in craft in the real world, and how can writers begin to upend these kinds of notions in their own writing?
Yeah, I kind of harp on about agency, and I think, from Aristotle on, we've been very invested in this project of the individual, which Aristotle himself and Greek philosophers were very invested in. But if you kind of come from other cultures or have lived in other places that don't necessarily think of the individual as the end all be all, then you might find that community is more important. And you might find that there's less of a belief in other places and other cultures in your absolute power as an individual to shape your own life. And growing up, I never felt like I had the kind of agency people had in books to be who I wanted to be, to make the changes I wanted to make. A lot of that agency seems to come from parents dying. That is its own weird thing. That I was adopted, and so I kind of lost a set of parents and gained a set of parents, but totally by chance, right, or by a force not my own. And I felt for most of my life, and often still now, that a lot of the things I have to live with and learn to live with and survive and even enjoy and be happy with are things that kind of come as pressures or forces from the outside. If you even go back to the Greeks and think about the way they talked about love or eros, they thought of that as an outside force. And you can think of that now too. I think a lot of us don't understand why we fall in love with certain people or why we're attracted to certain people. And it does feel like something's kind of like hammering at us, an arrow has been shot at us, and that kind of experience seems very true to life to me.
That's so interesting, because I remember in your book, what I remember was you talked about Milan Kundera and his notion. He didn't place a great deal of stock in agency or the psychological realism that is so popular in Western fiction. And I thought about that, and of course he grew up in Eastern Europe in an oppressive totalitarian government, so he felt his existence way different than I do.
Right, and The Art of the Novel, one of the great things about it is there's this long chapter of kind of literary criticism where he rewrites the history of the European novel, going from Cervantes to Kafka instead of kind of Homer to, I don't know, Jane Austen. And he says, like, Kafka was writing almost about that kind of totalitarian state before it was a thing. And sometimes people think, oh, he's like seeing into the future or something. And Kundera says, all we're writing all the time is a way of being in the world, right? A way of understanding the world. And this was always a possibility in the world. And Kafka was just seeing that as a possibility in the world. And it happened to come true in some places. But, I think it was probably just something he saw as like a force that's acting on his life. And you can see that in his notebooks and stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm watching the clock here, and I realize that this is now our time to segue to a writing prompt. And I think you've got a writing prompt from Craft in the Real World, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah. So, okay. I was asked to do a prompt about fears, which seems to go with the banned book theme.
And maybe I should tell viewers that this prompt, how long will it, we're going to give them 10 to 15 minutes to write. Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool.
That's what I think.
Let's go for 10 or 15 minutes. We'll do it.
So let's all, get out a piece of paper and, or, if you're at your computers, probably you are, jot down a list of fears that you have. Maybe think about them in the moment now. They could be fears that are kind of lasting from childhood, or fears of things that might happen to you in the future. But they should be, I think it's good to try to maybe avoid something triggering in this case and think about something irrational maybe. I have a fear of dolls, and I'm not sure whether it was because of Chucky or because my parents gave me a life-sized doll of myself when I was a child, and I hid it in the back of the closet and then was afraid that it would come to life every night and kill me. But that's one of my fears. I think if you can kind of list about 5 of those, that would be a good place to start. And those kinds of fears are always kind of tapping into something that you might yourself be trying to keep from writing, but might be something to look at. So I'll give you like a minute to do that. It's weird to do this online because usually I can see people writing and I know when to stop.
I'm writing.
Okay, so when you've got that list, I want you to choose one of them. Think about one that has a kind of potential for story. Um, I was thinking as I was waiting about Pinocchio, and maybe that's another reason I have a fear of dolls as an adoptee. The feeling that I wasn't like a real boy. Um, you try to make a story out of one of those fears. So just write one scene. It could be like an adopted child watching Pinocchio for the first time, feeling themselves in the belly of a whale, and their parents come out and they're kind of moving in a stiff way, and the child isn't sure which of them is the puppet. I'll give you about, let's say, 6 minutes. Got just about a minute left. Okay, so let's try to finish up those sentences. One of the things you might have noticed and that you might think about is the way in which that fear then changes the way the characters see the world. Um, so not thinking about it only from the inside, but also about the outside. The character in the scene that I just thought up um, came to see the parent differently, and from that point on, might understand something about the world that they haven't before. That world will be different then for them. I think I'm always thinking about how each character lives within their own idea of what the world is and the ways in which that is interrupted by different things that happen to them or different characters that come in and out of their lives. So now I want you to write the same scene from a different character's perspective. You know, in my example, it could be the parents. It could be, you know, somebody who just kind of witnessed it from the outside. Maybe a person walking past the house, looked in the window, saw this happening, thought that was a strange, heated interaction right there between a child and their parents. And think about how then that changes the sense of the world for the person outside of that fear. I'll give you another 6 minutes. This is a 1-minute call. So again, let's try to finish up those sentences. I want you to notice that between two worlds, there's a lot of story potential. I would love to hear your scenes, but I wish we were in real life. But there is a kind of suggestion to share what you've written in the chat. Maybe a favorite sentence or a small part of it would be a good idea. When you face your fears, or you confront your fears, or come up close to your fears, or when your characters do, it's often a kind of place where the character's world starts breaking down. And the same thing between two characters' ideas of the world. And in the prompt you just did, you should have noticed that you were already kind of dealing with each character having two different ideas of the world that were slightly rubbing up against each other. And then between the characters, there might also be some friction there between the two different ideas of the world. And I think a lot of times in that way of understanding things differently from somebody else, in a very specific way to a person, your experience, a character's experience, there's a lot of potential there to tell an interesting story. So hopefully you got something out of that. I think we are now doing questions. Is that randomly?
Yeah, we got questions from participants. I just want to say, Matthew, that exercise was so fascinating to me because I got way more out of it than I thought I would be, than I thought I would. Yeah, it was very, very revelatory in the sense that I think I'm going to pursue the story, and it was actually, revelatory in exactly the way you constructed it or just expressed it. This how fear makes a world crumble, and these different notions of fear or interaction with fear. I guess you used the word friction between two different perceptions of it. Yeah. Anyway, I found it fascinating within my own characters. So
yeah, that worked out.
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So Angela, we'll count on Angela to post any sentences that people share in our chat. We can't see your chat, at least not right now. But I did want to read. Let me see. There's a question here from a viewer, and I know a lot of writers are grappling with how to write about race. And the question is, how do you remove race from your books? Have you removed race from your books? I'm thinking about not including physical descriptions of my characters. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think those are two different questions. One is about race, and the other might be about physical descriptions. I don't think you can remove race from your books just because you can't remove race from the world. And there's also the fact that you can't determine who's going to read your book, and that people read a book in a real world context. So no matter how fantastical the world is, we're still reading it from the world in which we stand. And that's actually what makes some genre books really amazing, is that kind of distance or closeness between those two worlds. It's impossible, right, to remove race from our world. And so often the attempt to remove race from books ends up just kind of embedding the kind of bias into the work itself in a way that's not acknowledged by the text. And so I would strongly advise against that. I actually think a kind of more a way of kind of grappling with the difficulty of that is to actually go right at it and to admit that this is a part of our world, and to think about the ways in which it does affect different characters differently, and interactions between different characters differently, and the ways in which we have learned how to handle certain situations, survive in certain situations, find joy in certain situations. That's as much a part of your characters' lives, whether race is exactly the same as it is in our world, or some kind of look at, dwarves and elves and men from a position that is in our world. I think grappling with that is a way of doing something with race that will kind of admit that it's on the table, and that we have to write stories about race, and we always are writing stories about race, whether it's on the page or not.
Yeah, that's a great answer. This one is pulling away from writing one's own banned book, a form of self-censorship, or more of a case of I am trying to make my story match the official template, or something else?
Yeah, I think it can be so many different things. There's always a fear, I think, of writing certain things. There's also a fear of not writing certain things. A lot of us write on some level hoping for some kind of approval, whether it's from publication or from our readers or from just even the act of doing the writing, and some kind of self-approval. But that also means that we have kind of cultural expectations about what deserves approval, and those have been learned over a long period of time, and they're often kind of so invisible to us that we aren't kind of looking at them in a way that we can see what it is we're avoiding. So, I think it can be fear from those various ways. Banning ourselves can also be a thing, but it's the weird thing about rewriting a book, or at least in revising a book, is you're also revising the self as you're doing it, right? There's this. I saw this quote earlier today, I think, but there's a great Alexander Chee quote about how you're never the person who can write the book until you've written the book. So that's always what we're grappling with. We're always trying to become the person capable of doing the project, and we should always kind of be pushing and reaching for something that is at the current time beyond us.
That's so interesting. So you don't journey and then arrive at the book. Your journey is taking place with the book.
Right. Yeah.
Becoming a different person.
Yeah, I think great writing is also growing as a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to reference The Family Chow, that took Samantha Chang 15 years. And so I think that whole aesthetic shift, I'm just imagining it took also 15 years to think about that and execute it. Well, that brings up the next question I've got here is, do you have any advice for how we can find our own craft and learn to write in our own voices after being taught to copy norms we don't necessarily agree with?
Yeah. I often tell my students, right, like what we think of as finding our voice is really like understanding our place within our own reading history, right? Trying to find our aesthetics. And so it's not like thinking about yourself as separate from all these other stories that have passed, and trying to find like your own totally unique thing that is separate from all the reading that you've done. Is trying to understand how the reading you've done has informed you personally in a way that you can tell a story that you fits into the conversation you've been having with books your entire life, which is a different conversation than the one I've been having with books my entire life, and other people have been having with books their entire life. And I think that's often about expanding one's horizons, or trying to look even deeper into the kind of histories and traditions behind the books that you love and you want to be in conversation with. For me, I know writing my last novel, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear, I kind of had to go back to like ancient Korean literature, where I found one of the first things you could call a Korean novel is about kind of Robin Hood type character who creates doppelgangers of himself out of straw. And I was very surprised to find this, but I saw in it too a model that could help me understand how my own writing fits in a kind of tradition of writing, rather than kind of trying to stand totally on my own. I think the opposite maybe of trying to stand on the same mountain, George Saunders would say, right? Like you're kind of the mountain of Hemingway or Fitzgerald and James Joyce and other dead white modernists, mostly maybe, is to find another mountain, right? It's not to try to like stand on your own somewhere separate from everybody else, but to understand which mountain it is that you really want to stand on.
Yeah, that's an interesting segue into this next question. Let's see. Sorry, I lost it here in the chat. Oh, here it is. When you talk about the book with the halfway point turn to a different way of seeing the book, a different way of seeing yourself, the questioner wants to know if you can elaborate this, and how is this distinct from dominant neoliberal ideas about self-improvement and self-actualization and the corresponding changing goals, the self that happens in conventional literature? It's a big question.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question. So I'll give you an example. I taught this book last year. It's called Earthlings. It's by, I'm going to forget the name now, Sayako Murata, maybe something. And it's a great book, and it's about a woman who believes that she is an alien. And she starts off she's a child, and she's kind of going through just this, intense imaginative experience with her cousin. And then they kind of consummate a strange kind of alienish relationship, which results in the kind of adults like crashing down on them and trying to course correct them into like a societal norms. And so a lot of time passes and they grow up, and the beginning all happens like in this specific house that I think belongs to her grandmother. It's in the woods, and everybody lives in the city, and so they go there only on the holidays. And then after they've grown, they return to this house, and the book kind of makes us see that like in the same context, they've, the innocence in which they thought they were aliens before is now a kind of reaction to this like very strong and often violent socializing force that's pushing on them, trying to make them into what they would say is humans, and that what they don't want to be. Well, one of them does want to be, but anyway, the turn there isn't kind of understanding that the alienness is a way to is a kind of antidote to this like societal pressure that's being put upon them. The characters themselves don't necessarily understand this. I think it's fairly clear they have some awareness, and a lot of awareness of society in a way that makes it seem like the kind of machine that it is, but they're not really aware of what the alien belief is doing for them. It's more of a reader's intuition or realization that happens because we've come so far, and now I'm returning to the same place in this totally different context. So it's a way, it's not necessarily something about self-actualization for the characters. In that case, it's a way of seeing the world differently and seeing the kind of thematic importance of what's going on, in different ways as well. So I'm not sure if you need to read it's a wild and fantastic book, and I did a terrible job trying to describe it, but hopefully the point is kind of getting across in some way.
No, I love, and now whoever asked that question, and all of us, now we should go read that book and ponder how it answers the question.
I won't ruin the ending, but the ending is one of the most amazing endings you'll read.
Oh boy, okay, that's quite an endorsement. Next questioner says, I read that the word identity comes from two Latin words that mean repeatedly being. So I started internally identifying myself as a writer. Do you have any advice for how to identify as a writer?
Oh, I like that. Repeatedly being.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm often telling my daughter who's 11 um, that like you don't become a bad person like by just suddenly like becoming or choosing to become a bad person. That it's like all these little choices that you make, right? And that all the time you're making these choices about who you want to be. Right? Like any choice in a way is a choice about who you want to be. And you start kind of making these choices little by little, and then you find yourself somebody else, right? It's this kind of repeated, I like the repeated being there. Do I have any advice about how to identify as a writer? Maybe it's the same kind of thing. You just practice being what you wish you would be. And I don't know if we ever feel totally like we are writers or like we finally arrived. I keep hoping that it will happen someday, but it hasn't happened yet. I think we're just kind of continuously repeating, yeah, the act of being.
I think that's so interesting because I think a lot of people do think that you've arrived once you've written books like you have and once you teach writing and you receive awards and everything. And I forget, I was talking to Marlon James and interviewing him about rejection. And he was like, I get rejected all the time still. I think we don't know that published writers don't necessarily feel that they've arrived. And I even have a joke that everybody's an emerging writer, that it's kind of a ridiculous kind of segment of writers or label for them because we're all, yeah.
Yeah, or everybody's a writer. I have a friend who would say, sometimes you can feel like if you just belong to a certain circle, right, like kind of echelon or something, then you would feel like an insider finally. But he says there's always another circle within that circle, right? You never kind of get to the point.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Well, maybe this last question is a good one to end on, unless somebody else has a question to pose. We've got 4 minutes left, 3 minutes now. What advice do you have for someone trying to publish a piece that has societal controversies in it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure there's something without societal controversies within it. It's maybe about thinking about Sayaka yes, thank you, Grant. It's something about trying to decide, what you think is a controversy and which of those things you want to dive into, and how you can write the piece that grapples with the thing that you wish you can do. And I say that's thinking also that in the end we don't know anything, right? Because if we do think we know it, then we've kind of died in that knowledge, right? In some ways, like feeling a sort of static knowledge I often think of that as a kind of death. And you want to constantly understand that you don't know enough and constantly try to learn more and keep growing and keep writing better, right? And sometimes I'll have students who are kind of working on the same novel they started when they're in 5th grade, and I'll often say, but you're a better writer now, right? Like your ideas are better now. Everything is better now, and like each time you do a new thing, you're hopefully going to grow from it. How terrible would it be if you were still writing at the level you were writing when you were in 5th grade, right?
That's interesting. I love your observation that every story has societal controversies in it, because I think sometimes we might not view like certain stories of being necessarily about societal controversies, but I think every time a writer writes anything, we're being vulnerable, right, to some degree to ourselves and to some degree to the world if we show it to people. And so, keep writing banned books is really about like observing that vulnerability and finding your comfort level, I guess, but also thinking about how you can maybe go beyond that to write the truth.
My daughter has had enough of this webinar, I
think. Kids have a secret wisdom that we don't.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. There's so much to think about, and I'm just going to end by holding up your book because it's such a fabulous book, and I
Thank you
encourage.
so much, Graham.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone. This was wonderful. Great.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.